Hi and welcome back. So this is a slightly different video than I would normally upload and record, but I recently picked up some new PC hardware, wanted to run some tests to compare it based on what I've got down there at the moment. I thought I'd just upload and share the results. So my PC running down there, which is behind me, which you can't see, so probably shouldn't try and show you. My PC currently uses the i5 4670K, which for those who know their processors is the top end Haswell i5. Sorry about the squeaking chair, by the way. It's the top end Haswell i5 chip, and now this is the original Haswell, not the Haswell Refresh 4690K, and because of that, the chip in my PC runs so damn hot. It overclocks like a dog because it runs so hot. I'd done some overclocking with the thing recently because I bought the bloody K series, so you're damn right I'm going to do some overclocking with it, but it wasn't until recently that I found out that it was actually hitting a thermal limit and throttling itself. It wasn't until I started messing around with Intel Extreme Tuning Utility where that actually told me whether or not something was being throttled, unlike all the other tools like what I've been using, Open Hardware Monitor, HW Monitor, all the stuff like that. So I recently got my hands on an i5 2500K, which is the legendary Sandy Bridge i5 chip. In fact, I've actually got it down here, haven't I? Yeah. So this is going to sound awful. Whatever. So I got my hands on that, which is the Gigabyte. Let me get this right. G1.Sniper M3. Which is a little bit long-winded, with how much is in there? I can't actually remember how much memory I've got. How big are these modules? How big are these modules? I cannot remember how big these modules are. I'm pretty sure it's 8 gig of memory in here. I'm pretty sure these are 2 gig modules in here. 8 gig of memory, and the i5 2500K, and a stock crappy Intel cooler. This I picked up quite cheap. Put this away a second. I should probably cut this bit out, really. Sorry about that. Yeah, I picked that up quite cheap because if you know anything about overclocking any of the recent Intel chips, the i5 2500K has something of a legendary reputation in terms of how well it can overclock. So I thought I'd run some tests against it based on the overclocked chip. My screens have gone off. Come back screens. I thought I'd run some tests against it based on my current setup now, see which one was actually going to give me the better performance. So, because if the 2500K can overclock like a beast and is more powerful and can be more powerful than the Haswell chip I've got now, I might as well use it for my daily driver. So I try to keep all the parts the same wherever possible between the tests. Obviously, we're talking about two different sockets here, two different architecture revisions, so I can't use the same motherboard and same motherboard on each one. Hopefully I can bring up a photo of these. I think I took some photos, didn't I? Fairly sure. I'll pull up a photo of these, but we've got Corsair Vengeance Pro 2.4 GHz DDR3 memory. I've got some notes on my laptop here, which is why I keep looking down here. My graphics card is a MSI GTX 970 Gaming 4G, 4 gig. The power supply is an EVGA 550 GS. I was using a SanDisk SSD plus 240 gig for the main hard drive. That's only about a couple of weeks old actually. They were on offer on Amazon. Using a Cooler Master Sadon 120V V2 all-in-one water cooler. And then for the Haswell setup, which what's down there now, I've got the Asus Z87K motherboard, along with obviously the i5 4670K, and the one I've just talked about, the G1.Sniper M3 and the i5 2500K. I didn't use the memory that I bought. I used the same memory that's in the PC now, just to try and eliminate that as a variable. So the tests that I ran were Cinebench R15, PC Mark Creative Suite, but from the Creative Suite I was only really interested in video editing part 2 because that kind of reflects the workloads that I actually do with it. We also ran Unigine Valley. Spoiler alert, that was kind of pointless. Crystal Disk Mark, there shouldn't be any difference in the hard drive speeds, but just for shits and giggles, why not? And Prime 95 I used in order to stress test everything and max out the temperatures. Obviously I included a couple of games then because that's what I'm primarily concerned with, is gaming performance. We had Metro Last Light Redux, and Middle-earth: Shadow of Mordor, which are the only few games I could find in my games library which have actually got built-in benchmarks. I would prefer to use a built-in benchmark utility because it's repeatable. Then it takes the human element out of the equation. I don't have to like follow a certain path around a map or try and do the same thing 3 or 4 times in a row. I just click the button and let it go. I was going to include GTA 5, but apparently Rockstar can't provide a download surface worth a damn because it was taking a hell of a long time to download all 65 gigabit. Honestly, their download service through, what the hell is that thing called? Social Club, Rockstar Social Club. It's terrible. It would hit about 7 or 8 meg, then drop right down to about 3 meg, 4 meg, and for comparison, Shadow of Mordor was downloading on Steam at 25 megs a second consistently. So fucking sort it out, Rockstar, please. Anyway, I'm not expecting the GPU to make a drastic difference in games anyway. It's all about the GPU when it comes to games, but my graphics card overclocks really, really well, to be honest. I was running it at stock because I kind of want to take the GPU out of the equation, just see what the difference is for the CPU. But that card can overclock like nothing you've seen. It's ridiculous. So, speaking of overclocking, nice little segue. The i5 2500K, obviously I overclocked that. There's no point running it at stock. At stock, the Haswell will beat it, probably not by much. I managed to get it up to 4.5 gigahertz. No, that's actually, I've got some notes elsewhere on that one because I took these as I was doing it. So, running it at a V-core of 1.36 volts over the 1.25 volt standard, I managed to get it up to 4.5 gigahertz. I couldn't seem to get it to do to take a base clock overclock whatsoever. Every time I try and adjust the base clock, it would, even 2 or 3 megahertz, it just would not have it. So that was purely just a multiplier only. That was just overclocked purely through the multiplier. I actually set the BIOS. I actually set the core voltage in BIOS to 1.36 volts, but in measuring it in Windows, it was actually slightly higher than that. It was actually running at 1.38 V-core. Because I'd set the load line, CPU load line calibration, and I'm sorry if I lose people here. I set the load line calibration up as high as it will go, and what that does, it just kind of smooths out the voltages that the process is getting. So instead of, when it tries to bump up the voltage, instead of like, so it's trying to supply 1.36 volts and then suddenly it goes, when you put any load on it, it keeps it up. It keeps it at a consistently higher level just to eliminate that voltage droop. But the side effect of that is that it does slightly push up the voltage by a couple of 100 millivolts, which accounts for the 1.36 to 1.38 jump. And yeah, I think that was about it. It wasn't as much as I was expecting, if I'm perfectly honest, but I think possibly with a bit more tuning, a bit more tweaking than I had time for, I could probably get it up higher than that. But 4.5 gigahertz, that's a fairly respectable overclock, to be quite honest. And the voltages weren't too high either. Officially, I think I've seen numbers thrown around that 1.35 is all that Intel really specify this chip for, but I don't know how reliable that is. From the generally accepted limit with this chip is that you wouldn't really want to go above 1.4 volts for everyday use. And obviously, if I was going to be using the 25600K, it would be everyday use. So just a little bit under that limit. Anyway, that's enough of me waffling now. So we're gonna change scenes now, and I'll go and show you the results. And let's see how I got on.
Okay, so here we go. One thing I didn't cover a moment ago actually was how I actually ran all these tests, and that was that each benchmark, where possible, was repeated 3 times, with the exception of a couple of them where it repeats them itself naturally. So Crystal Disk Mark will automatically run each test 5 times and give you an average result, and the PC Mark suite by default will the Creative Suite and PC Mark, or all PC Mark benchmarks, I guess, will repeat themselves 3 times. But for everything else, whether it was manual or automated, they were run at least 3 times. I think the only one that wasn't run 3 times, and it doesn't really count because it's not a benchmark with a stress test. So anyway, that's enough waffling now, so let me get on with it and actually show some results. So first of all, I'm going to go through the gaming GPU results, and I'll come to the CPU performance last, the part I'm actually interested in. So this was the performance then in Metro Last Light Redux. So with the 4670K stock, we got 46 frames per second minimum, average, 144 FPS maximum, and then a minimum of 13. So the i5 2500K, the 2500K overclocked, wasn't actually that far away from it. So it was so close, and in fact in minimum frame rates, obviously the CPU is not holding things back there, but the other results are so close that they are statistically not significant. So, moving on to Shadow of Mordor, you can see pretty much the same thing. So we had an average frame rate of at least 83 frames per second. The maximum frame rates were up over 110, and the minimum was just below 60 FPS. And again, these variations are so close that in practical terms it makes absolutely no difference. Lastly here then we have Unigine Valley, and here the results again are so close that it makes no statistical difference. So the takeaway from that then is that, and I kind of knew this anyway, but once you hit a certain performance level, in terms of once you hit a certain CPU performance level, that no longer becomes the limiting factor when you're playing games. It's all down to the GPU, and that is definitely evidenced here by my benchmark results. So let's move on to the hard drive speeds. So now I wasn't expecting much difference here, and for the most part there isn't. So when we look at the sequential, so we're looking at the sequential read and write speeds, there's very little in it. Then we look at the random read speeds, and they're very, very close. But when we look at the random write speeds, now this was something that I was not expecting at all. There does seem to be a difference there. So we've got 118.8 write for single queue depth random 4 kilobyte writes on the 2500K, but we've then got 140.9 for the 4670K stock, which that's actually quite significant, because, and then looking at the multiple queue random 4K write speeds, is significantly different, and to be the vast majority of the time, unless you're playing a video file, and not even then, that's not even guaranteed, the vast majority of the time your hard drive is going to be spent doing random read and write, random reads and random write. So random read, there's not very much difference at all, but random write, there is actually a significant difference there, which I really wasn't expecting at all, which quite surprised me. So let's move on then to temperatures and see how we got on. Now, I mentioned right at the outset that I was hitting the thermal limit when I was overclocked, and the Haswells, the original Haswell chip, had a very poor thermal interface material, which was improved in subsequent generations, and that is definitely borne out by these tests. So now in these figures, I have included the stock speed. In the other ones, in the earlier graphs you saw, we weren't including the stock results, but I just wanted to include the stock 2500K results here, just so that we can get an idea, of how vastly different it is. So you might have noticed here that this is measuring delta T. Now, delta T is, for those who don't know, is a difference between the ambient temperature of the room, the environment you're in, and the device under test. So for most of these, the ambient temperature was up around, if I remember correctly, 25 to 28 degrees, something like that. So what we do that is when we take these measurements, we also take the ambient temperature measurement at the same time, and then subtract the ambient temperature from the actual measured temperature. Now, the reason we do that is because let's say you've got all your components switched off, your computer switched off, it's just been sitting in your room, and let's say your room is at 25 degrees, which is kind of warm actually. This is Britain, for crying out loud. Anyway, let's say it's all sitting, your ambient room temperature is 25 degrees. That means that your computer and all your components in there are going to have an ambient temperature of 25 degrees. Now that's before the processor even does any work. So what we're actually measuring here is how far above the ambient temperature, how much excess heat over and above ambient temperature do the components actually generate. So I'm going to stop waffling about delta T now and actually talk about the results. So looking at idle first of all, we've got around, what's that? I would say that's an average of 13, maybe 13.5 degrees delta T. This is degrees centigrade, by the way. I'm sorry, I don't do Fahrenheit. Fahrenheit is weird. You can look up the conversions yourself. But you're talking an average of about 13.5 degrees at idle, which is pretty good, to be fair. The 2500K is slightly higher at idle, and that's probably because it's running at a higher voltage than everything else. But those are pretty good idle temperatures, and that's just purely down to the performance of the Cooler Master Sadon all-in-one water cooler. Looking at the stress tests, however, things are a vastly different story. So the 4670K stock is running at 50, practically almost as near as makes no difference to 55 degrees delta T, and in real terms, the absolute temperature measurement there, if I remember correctly, was actually up at around 80 degrees, which is very, very damn high. The 2500K stock was startlingly different. It's absolutely ridiculous, 36.1 degrees delta T, and if I remember correctly, that didn't get up above around 62, 63 degrees was the absolute measurement there, which is fantastic. And then we can see what I was saying about a moment ago when we look at the overclocked i5 2500K stress test temperature here. We can see what I was saying about how poor the thermal interface was on Haswell, and that's part of the thing. One of the things they did in Haswell Refresh was improve the thermal interface material, because we came out at a lower temperature of 52.1 degrees delta T versus the stock speed of the 4670K was practically 55 degrees, which is ridiculous. So for a higher clock speed, you're getting a lower temperature, and that just really illustrates how bad Haswell is. Okay, and that's enough about temperatures, because what I'm really interested in here are the results then of the actual CPU tests. So moving on then, Cinebench R15 here. So we can see the scale goes from 0 to the 700 here. Now this is something to watch out for in a lot of benchmarks, is that they will only show you, for example, between 400 and 700 here, or 400 and, I don't know, 650, and that makes it look like the difference is a lot bigger than it actually is. You should always make sure that the scale you're looking at is referenced to 0, because then you will actually see, it gives you a better visual indication of just how different they are. And in this case, we can see that the 2500K overclocked scored about 50 points more than the 4670K. I did work this out before. That's about a 17% performance increase, if I remember correctly, which is fairly good, to be honest. This is an older generation processor, albeit running heavily overclocked, but running cooler and giving a better result. So let's move on then to the very last number here, which was the PC Mark Creative Suite Video Editing Part 2. Now this is measured in seconds here, and the 2500K overclocked again comes out better than the 4670K. That's a difference of about 10 seconds in that test, which came out to about 20%. So you're talking an average of about 17 or 18% performance improvement for the i5 2500K. Overclocked again, but it runs at a lower temperature than the chip I've already got. So given that video editing is one of the big workloads that I actually put my PC through, this is actually a fairly significant result as far as I'm concerned. That 10 seconds, it may not sound like much of a difference, but that's a 20% difference, and that's a 20% difference, and that really can add up. If you're rendering something which is 100 minutes, which is going to take you 100 minutes, 20% takes that down to 80 minutes. So, you know, that is actually fairly significant. Okay, that's enough looking at numbers now.
Okay, so what are the conclusions from all those numbers and all those 141 data points that I collected? So first of all, I think the first observation is that the majority of those tests that I ran weren't necessarily valid. Like I said just not long ago, when it comes to gaming, it really is the graphics card that makes all the difference. I'd never seen that effect in action personally before. Now I have. So it turns out the majority of those tests didn't necessarily show any difference. But based on the two pure CPU tests that I did run, the overclocked 2500K Sandy Bridge chip clearly beats the stock i5 4670K Haswell chip. Now, it's not necessarily a fair comparison, because I'm taking a chip which, do you know what, I don't even know what the 2500K stock speed is, but I'm taking Oh yes, it's 33. It had a multiplier of 33. So I'm taking a chip which normally runs at 3.3 gigahertz, although turbo boosts up a little bit higher than that, and I'm pushing it up to 4.5 gigahertz, which is a 1.2 gigahertz overclock, and that's fairly significant. And you might say it's probably not necessarily a valid comparison to look at a heavily overclocked Sandy Bridge chip versus a stock 4670K. However, the problem is that there is very little headroom for overclocking with my 4670K. So applying even just 200 to 300 megahertz overclock, I was reaching that thermal limit, and the CPU would throttle itself and pull itself back down. I actually ran it overclocked for a long time, like I said right at the start of this, and it wasn't until the last couple of months when I started playing around with Intel Extreme Tuning Utility. Extreme Tuning Utility was telling me how much it was actually throttling it by and giving me a better measurement of temperature. So Haswell doesn't have a reputation of being a great overclocker anyway, and that's certainly borne out by my experience. And not only that, but the temperatures run much higher. So while you might say it's not a fair comparison to look at a heavily overclocked processor of an older generation versus a stock processor at a newer generation, it is a fair comparison between, I still think it is a fair comparison between what you can do with these two processors. Now granted, there are things like, you can do things to your Haswell like delidding, like removing the integrated heat spreader, replacing the thermal interface material, seal it all back down, and that will make a difference to your temperatures. So to get back to some kind of point to all this, I guess, yes, the 2500K did outperform the Haswell, but it is significant in terms of statistical significance. So what did we say? It was about an average of about 17 to 20% better across the two pure CPU bound tests that I did, and statistically that is fairly significant. I mean, even if it was only, say, 5 to 10% performance, you could still call that, based on the numbers, you could still call that a significant difference. However, in practical terms, what really counts for the kind of workloads that I do these days, so a lot of video rendering and video editing and things like that, what counts for a lot of that stuff is the number of cores that you have, and the more cores you can throw at things, the better. And that's one thing that did not change between these two processors, is the number of cores. So although I'm going to get better performance out of the 2500K, I don't actually think I'm going to be switching that to my daily driver. I think, to be quite honest, I will probably stick with the Haswell for now. I may look into getting it delidded at some point and see what I can do with it, because I do know of somebody who's actually offering to delid the chips for about 20 to 25 pounds, which is a bit of a bargain if you ask me, and that's applying decent thermal paste and resealing the integrated heat spreader back down. So I don't think there's going to be much of a difference to the actual my day-to-day performance, and especially when it comes to gaming, there is absolutely zero difference. So if it takes me 20% longer to render one of these videos than it would do on the 2500K, I really don't think that's a problem, because I can just leave it going here and go make myself a cup of tea. Anyway, that's probably enough for now. I may do more PC tech kind of videos in the future. I don't know yet, but anyway, that's enough. You've probably had enough of me waffling. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again.